Welcome everyone to this, the fifth session of our book club, Reasoned Argument, the Counter to Cancel Culture. Those of you who are over 35 may remember the comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes. The comic strip stopped in 1995, but it's still much remembered. And on the 20th anniversary, there was this article in the Wall Street Journal, Calvin and Hobbes, America's profound comic strip. Why profound? Well, it's got to be profound when a cartoonist has the nerve to name his strip after a 16th century theologian and a 17th century political philosopher. Who would do that? Someone who really understood a great deal about a broad field of learning. So look at this quote from the Wall Street Journal op-ed that I referenced before. The late political scientist James Q. Wilson, by the way, known to many in the Federalist Society, described Calvin and Hobbes as our only popular explication of the moral philosophy of Aristotle. Wilson meant that the social order is founded on self-control and delayed gratification, and that Calvin, that is the Calvin in the cartoon strip, is hopeless at those things. The great irony is that these two characters, named for historical figures, are just the opposite of what the historical figures were. That is, reflects that the cartoonist Bill Watterson was full of irony as he was going about raising very interesting questions for you to think about without his really answering them. In any event, Calvin, the real Calvin, John Calvin, theologian, was known for self-denial. Hobbes, on the other hand, in the cartoon, is playful and kind. Yet, unlike the historical Hobbes, who was known for his saying the following. According to Hobbes, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not a very pleasant picture of life on this earth. Beyond that, I'm not going to be commenting on the comic strip, but the reason I'm using Calvin and Hobbes, they're going to be the bookends to tonight's session. So Calvin is going to relate to the Puritans in England and in America, and the absolutism in England that the Puritans were fighting against, how that affected the colonies, and that at the other end, Hobbes and his prescriptions are to defend absolutism. So we're going to want to look at and think about, in the following think points, these three things. So here are our three think points for tonight. The first is Anglo-American Republicanism and Calvinism. Two, from rights of Englishmen to unalienable rights, and we're going to go over Adams, Paine, and Henry. Three, Hobbesian absolutism versus federalism. So first we go to Anglo-American Republicanism and Calvinism. The 17th century saw two political revolutions in England. These revolutions were felt in the colonies, especially because there were Puritans both in England and in the colonies. But those in the colonies were obviously far away, and initially they weren't as affected by the first revolution, and that was the revolution related to the English Civil Wars. The second revolution, the bloodless revolution called the Glorious Revolution, was celebrated in the colonies after it occurred. And on that basis, later, we will find Otis and others talking about the rights of Englishmen and tying it back, as the Glorious Revolution did, to Magna Carta. Like many Protestant denominations, the the Puritans took much of their theology from John Calvin. So why is that important for the American Revolution? Well, at the time, it is estimated that about 2/3 of the colonial population in America had been trained or educated in the school of Calvin. Now, there were different versions, and still are, and different degrees of adherence to the teachings of Calvin. But for instance, in Massachusetts, you have the Puritans and the Congregationalists are the churches that are related to that. In New York, it's the Dutch Reform. Charleston, it was the Huguenots. And of course, a little bit later when we talk about Thomas Paine being in Philadelphia, we'll mention the Quakers. Point is that the Quakers, the Puritans, and others were dissenters. Dissenters against what? The established English church, headed by the monarch, where there was a union in the person of the monarch of church and state. So who is John Calvin? Many of you in the audience will know much better than I who he is and understand more of his teaching. But he was trained as a lawyer. And probably because of his lawyer training, he was the first to systematize Protestant theology. His famous work was the Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536 in Switzerland. From France, went to Geneva, and there was the focus in the Geneva area of what he was doing. Many say he was the founder of Presbyterianism and the Reformed Protestant churches. He also had influence on other parts of the Protestant denominations. So, did Calvin's teaching have political implications? Scholars have debated that point. We're not going to debate it here. We're just going to look at the historical facts in terms of England and how it is that Puritans got deeply involved in politics. The Puritans were certainly influenced by Calvin, but does that mean that they were really Calvinists? That's another point to be debated, and we're not going to get into that point. What's important is the English situation pitted the Puritans against a state religion, where they wanted to purify the state religion. That is, in the view of the Puritans, a name that came to be attached to them because they wanted to purify the Church of England, the official state church, of elements of Catholicism that they thought were still present, namely in terms of ritual and hierarchy, which seemed in many ways to be a continuation of the Catholic Church, just without the Pope, and instead having the monarch as head of the church. So this dispute regarding the Church of England ended up being a political war where the Puritans sided with Parliament against the king, and supporting the king were those who were happy with the Church of England, and even some Catholics supporting the monarch. That led to a very bloody period from 1640 to 1651. And ultimately, Parliament and the Puritans won. They won in a battle. Well, how was that possible? Because Parliament had its own army, the New Model Army. Now, that's quite different from the United States in terms of the army, although funded by Congress, is under the control of the President of the United States. That's one of the lessons that comes out of the Civil War. The other lesson, ultimately, after the following period of the interregnum, which we'll talk about just briefly, is that you don't want to provoke religious wars. That's one of the main lessons that is applicable in the United States and that the U.S. Constitution, backed up by the Declaration, is designed in a way to prevent religious wars. After the win by Parliament and the Puritans, we had what was called the Commonwealth, or a republic at that period of time. But it's not going to be a terribly successful republic. It merged the legislative and the executive. Remember, the army, Parliament had control of the army. And they reduced Parliament to one house, the House of Commons. And the new state religion became Puritanism. But then they had to have some kind of executive, and that became the leader of the army, Oliver Cromwell, who takes over and becomes Lord Protector. By the time Cromwell died in 1658, people of England were pretty tired of strict Puritan rule. Although Cromwell was succeeded by a son for 2 or so years, which seemed to be strange for somebody who opposed monarchy, the people wanted and restored the monarchy. And what we have is the restoration of King Charles II. And he rules from 1666 to 1688. The period is known as the Restoration. That is the restoration of the kings. And Charles II was fairly successful because he agreed to religious toleration, and he gave amnesty for his former political and military enemies. So in 1685, Charles is succeeded by James II, who was a Catholic, and again, that disturbs many in England, in particular in the Parliament. So what you have after that is the attempt by people in Parliament, members of Parliament, to recruit William and Mary to come to England. And they do so, and that creates the nearly bloodless revolution. And it follows with the English Bill of Rights. William and Mary were considered equals in terms of the crown. That is, Mary was the daughter, the Protestant daughter of James II, who was a Catholic. But in making the deal with William and Mary, the parliamentarians were concerned about a number of things. Well, first of all, the English Bill of Rights will allow for freedom of religion, but not for Catholics. But it will, more importantly, in some ways, begin what we see and come to know as separation of powers. That is, the army is moved away from the parliament and into the monarchy, one of the few powers that they really have. But the monarch cannot have a standing army without the permission of the parliament. So we get this division of authority that we see carried over into our own constitution, and the beginnings, as I said, of what we know as separation of powers. Indeed, Montesquieu, the Frenchman, looks at the British model and calls it separation of powers. It's more a separation of function than of powers per se. So now we move to the second section, from rights of Englishmen to unalienable rights. Adams, Paine, and Henry. We're going to look at their thoughts as expressed in writing and orally. Let's begin with the Pilgrims as they come over to North America. Initially, the Pilgrims create the first permanent settlement in the U.S. There was an earlier one at Jamestown. And in fact, they were on their way to the Virginia area when they didn't land in the right place. And as a result, they actually experienced what philosophers will call the state of nature. And that's going to be important later when we come to the third section. So after landing and establishing the Plymouth plantation, other Puritans eventually come and populate much of what we call New England. And it's represented, or they are represented, in congregational churches throughout that area. And Puritanism has a strong impact. on that area. But there's something different, at least, about the initial Pilgrims. They were separatists. That is, unlike the English Puritans who stayed within the Church of England and tried to, quote, purify it, they simply separated from it. Now, they were very sympathetic to the Puritans in England, but as I said before, they're far away, so they're not immediately affected by the civil wars, although later, by the Second Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, now it's clear that all subjects of the British monarchy, of England, are in fact entitled to certain rights. And that's the basis then for what Otis in particular and John Adams are doing. Years later, John Adams would say the following about the argument made by James Otis. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there the child independence was born. In 15 years, i.e. in 1776, he grew up to manhood and declared himself free. Of course, during those 15 years, there was a lot going on in Massachusetts, lots of conflict, and it starts to really boil beginning with the Stamp Act. Both Otis and Adams argued against the Stamp Act, but Adams did something else as well. Remember, he was willing to go against the tide in defending the British soldiers. But here he goes against the violence of the mobs. That is to say that some of the protests ended up being violent. And Adams insisted that you couldn't have violence in protests, that it violated the notion of the rule of law. Unfortunately, today, some people don't understand that and are willing to endorse protests as nonviolent when maybe they're not completely nonviolent. As important and as eloquent as both Otis and Adams were, they are well known and know how to argue to the audience in their own area. That is a largely Puritan audience. It's not that their talents will not be spread further, but that is their base. But for the revolution to go forward, we need more than New England. So now we're going to turn to both Philadelphia because of Thomas Paine, the Center for the Quakers. Virginia, of course, is the home of many great patriots. We're going to be focusing in this section on Patrick Henry and his eloquence. Indeed, but for the eloquence of both Paine and Henry, it is doubtful that the Declaration of Independence would have occurred, at least at the time that it did, and who knows, maybe not at all. That is, they were the ones that actually motivated the public to push in the direction of independence when many of the more educated leaders, you might say, were not as eager to go forward with an act of independence. Thomas Paine was not as well educated as the others we've been looking at, but he had an amazing ability with words. And whereas some of the other founders were more theoretical and spoke a language that not maybe the ordinary person on the street could understand, that was not Thomas Paine's problem. Just the opposite. He was able to connect, if you will, with the ordinary person, and without his rhetoric, as I said before, it might not have been the case that the Declaration was signed when it was, or maybe not at all. So let's look at the impact, more than anything else, about this document. Just to give some indication of the impact of the pamphlet Common Sense, it sold at the time 500,000 copies. And that really makes it percentage-wise probably the best-selling American book ever. In today's terms, I've read that it would be the equivalent of a bestseller with 10 million copies. But let's also get a reaction from an historian. Here, as Jefferson's biographer, Joseph Ellis, has written, common sense, quote, swept through the colonies like a firestorm, destroying any final vestige of loyalty to the British crown. Wow, what an impact. In addition to the impact it had on the movement towards independence, it had a huge impact on shifting the mentality in terms of what a government should be structured as. That is to say, the mixed form of government that characterized the British form of government, which we've talked about before, the mixed regime, that is undercut tremendously, as indicated by Forrest McDonald's book, Novus, Ordo, Seclorum. As McDonald writes, many American patriots became disillusioned with the idea of checks and balances. Did you hear that? They became disillusioned with checks and balances by reading a single grand polemical tract, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. How could they be disillusioned with checks and balances? Don't we hear that our government today is one of checks and balances? We do hear that. And that's part of the distortion of our Constitution. In fact, what we should realize is that Paine drove us towards separation of powers. Let's read again what McDonald says in addition. After Paine's onslaught, Americans tended, by and large, to embrace the doctrine of separation of powers rather than the idea of checks and balances. That is a huge shift that has all kinds of consequences. Why is it that we still talk about checks and balances? This goes to the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over the meaning of separation of powers. They didn't argue over checks and balances. What happened is that the version of separation of powers promoted by the Federalists and adopted into the Constitution was a different form from what was understood from Montesquieu in terms of the advocacy coming from the Anti-Federalists. We can't go deeply into that now, but it is important that the new version of separation of powers in the Federalists has a checking function that's important, but it's not checks and balances. Well, then how did checks and balances come back? That's a later part of the story when we get after the Civil War and we begin with the development of the administrative state. Talk about that certainly in the last session today a little bit, and also very importantly in the last of these 13 sessions. So we have one of the most important shifts in political thinking of ordinary people carried through because of a devastating argument made by Paine that was successful in a way that the arguments of others were not with the general population. So let's hear some of Paine's written rhetoric spoken, and you can hear how powerful it can be.
We have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again.
So what do you think John Adams' reaction was to all of this? In Thoughts on Government, Adams wrote that Paine's ideal sketched in Common Sense was, quote, so democratical, without any restraint or even an attempt at any equilibrium or counterpoise, that it must produce confusion and every evil. For many, Paine was simply too radical. But one of the things I'm attempting to show as we go through different writers and speakers is that they end up balancing each other out in a wonderful way. And that is what happened in the Constitutional Convention as well. We had great minds, great speakers, great deliberators who balanced each other in a wonderful way to produce a product that none of them by themselves could have produced. Ironically, Adams actually benefits from the impact of Paine's work, the common sense. What happens is that the drive for independence heats up, and there is a call from the Continental Congress to have states begin forming their own constitutions. In other words, the revolutionary spirit is moving along. And to whom do they go to in order to give them what should be in a constitution? Well, many of them go right to John Adams, and that is the basis for his work, thoughts on government.
We ought to consider what is the end of government before we determine which is the best form. Upon this point, all speculative politicians will agree that the happiness of society is the end of government, as all divines and moral philosophers will agree that the happiness of the individual is the end of man. From the principle, it will follow that the form of government which communicates ease, comfort, security, or in one word, happiness, to the greatest number of persons and in the greatest degree is the best. All sober inquiries after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that the happiness of man, as well as his dignity, consists in virtue. Confucius, Zoroaster, Socrates, Mahomet, not to mention authorities really sacred, have agreed in this. If there is a form of government, then, whose principle and foundation is virtue, will not every sober man acknowledge it better calculated to promote the general happiness than any other form?
This is really interesting in many ways because the theme of virtue is what the Anti-Federalists emphasized. Not that the Federalists were against virtue. No, they wanted to promote it. The question was what form was best. You might think from some of this that Adams would have been on the Anti-Federalist side. No, he was on the Federalist side. But importantly, he, as well as Jefferson, were ambassadors abroad. So neither of them was at the Constitutional Convention, which might have been very different if one or both of them were there. We'll look now at something regarding a point of conflict, an important point, as between Adams and Jefferson. Although Adams has a lot of influence in these other states that are looking for constitutions, we need to transition and look more closely at Virginia. We've put a lot of emphasis on Massachusetts at this point. As important as Massachusetts is or was, we still have to realize that without Virginia, we're not going very far here. And Adams and Jefferson are friends. They're working together. But I want to remind you of the differences that Forrest McDonald mentioned and that I talked about in the last session, and that is the difference between Puritanical Republicanism and Agrarian Republicanism. Adams obviously personifying the Puritanical Republicanism, and Jefferson personifying the Agrarian Republicanism. So despite the fact that they're friends, there's still some sharp differences. And I want to put up this letter from Jefferson responding to Adams as evidence really of how different they are in their attitudes or outlooks towards republicanism. In Jefferson's response, he mentions that Adams has said that he hopes that I may continue in life and health until I become a Calvinist. Wow. At least in this exclamation, and I won't attempt to pronounce the French, would make me immortal. I can never join Calvin in addressing his God. He was indeed an atheist. Wow. Which I can never be, or rather, his religion was demonism. If ever man worshipped a false god, he did. Those words could be considered fighting words, and yet they're still friends. And that's very important, but still, more is needed to get Virginia on board in a more forceful way than they have been at this point. And that's where Patrick Henry comes in and his great speech about give me liberty or give me death. And again, let's hear from Spud McConnell.
No man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as abilities of the very noble, worthy gentlemen who have just addressed the House. But different men often see the same subject in different lights, and therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen if, entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, I shall speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. It is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country and an act of disloyalty toward the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings. Mr. President, it is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves and the House. Is it that insidious smile with which our petition has been lately received? Trust it not, sir. It will prove a snare to your feet. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with those warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last arguments to which kings resort. I ask, gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array, if its purpose be not to force us to submission? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging. And what have we to oppose to them? Shall we try argument? Sir, we have been trying that for the last 10 years. Have we anything new to offer upon the subject? Nothing. We have held the subject up in every light of which it is capable, but it has all been in vain. Shall we resort to entreaty and humble supplication? What terms shall we find which have not been already exhausted? Let us not, I beseech you, sir, deceive ourselves. So we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne, and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded. And we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after these things, we may indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, and which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemy shall have us bound hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak, if we make a proper use of those means by which the God of nature hath placed in our power. The millions of people, armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir. Let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
Action. Among great patriots, there were these tensions, rivalries indeed. We already saw what Adams thought about Paine's work. As effective as it was in the cause of independence, it also put forward a political philosophy in part with which Adams couldn't agree. And there's tension in a certain sense, and will explode later, between Adams and Jefferson. And between Jefferson and Patrick Henry, from whom we'll hear shortly, there was cooperation during independence, but there was this rivalry. And later in life, Jefferson later undermined the legacy of Patrick Henry. And while Jefferson and Paine were friends, some of the things that Paine wrote later on, in terms of both the French Revolution, which Jefferson supported, but especially later his attack on Christianity, caused political difficulties for Jefferson himself. In any event, Paine may have been a political Paine, but his language was so powerful that Washington used it in order to encourage his troops. It's one thing to get all fired up about independence, but once into the war, reality sets in. So let's first of all hear from Paine again.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.
Let's go to the third section, Hobbesian absolutism versus federalism. In the brief introduction of Thomas Hobbes, I quoted the most famous statement in his work, The Leviathan. When we started this session and I referred to Hobbes, I quoted from his most famous language. That quote is at the end of a fuller paragraph that I want to show to you and read parts of. So in the full paragraph, we have Hobbes saying, whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war. He lived through the English Civil War, where every man is enemy to every man. The same is consequent to the time wherein men lived without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such a condition, there is no place for the following. What he is describing is the so-called state of nature. He comes along before Locke. And his state of nature is brutish, as we've already described it, in which, back to text, there's no place for industry because the full fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently, no culture on the earth, no navigation, nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving, no knowledge, no arts, no letters, no society. In other words, devastation, basically. Why? Because there is continual fear and danger of violent death. That's the motivator. We're going to go to that motivator and spend a little more time on that. And now, again, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You may have never read Hobbes's Leviathan, but maybe in high school or elsewhere, you read Lord of the Flies. To the best of my knowledge from my high school time reading the book, it's about boys who are deserted and left alone with no authority, and they engage in savage activities. That is a commentary on human nature that is describing in a modern way, I guess, what Hobbes is talking about, everyone against everyone. And that's supposed to be the justification for Hobbes's plan or solution to have absolute rule. Now, Hobbes himself was a monarchist, but he wasn't limiting this to monarchy. It could apply to a commonwealth. Whatever the form of government, as far as Hobbes was concerned, that government was sovereign. It had to have full power. And the way it got full power was by exploiting the fear of natural death. That is, the fear of violent death. Fear has been a major source of motivation in many governments, in the past as well as today. So, to the contrary, we've had the tradition in the Anglo-American world since the Glorious Revolution of rejecting at least the absolutism of a monarchy. But there can be other forms of absolutism. And power is always trying to take over. It's the nature of human nature working with power. Hobbes's view, which was very brutal, some would say just realistic, was not well received, and it was subject to a great deal of criticism. Later, John Locke will come along and have what looks to be a different state of nature. But whether it's Hobbes' state of nature or Locke's state of nature, it's largely a device in which to analyze and discuss government. In other words, it is a form of discussion about individualism as being the base of government. Then the question is, where do you go from there? Hobbes goes clearly in one direction, and Locke, who was much more popular and cited, remember, in Jefferson's statement about the influences of the time. Locke was very popular at the time. Now, scholars debate a couple of things that, again, we're not going to debate. One is, were Hobbes and Locke on the question of the state of nature really that different? That's one thing. The other thing is, while Locke has an influence clearly on the colonial experience and the move for independence, question is, what was, if any, Hobbes's role? And again, scholars debate this as to what it was or wasn't. We're not going to be going there. Where I want to go is in terms of the Leviathan, because we're always, at any given time, in need of defending rights by preventing the power that exists in government from expanding beyond its legitimate boundaries. While the device of a state of nature may be merely an analytical device for political theorists, those who came over on the Mayflower actually found themselves in a state of nature. They had planned to end up in Virginia where there was a colony, but they ended up at Plymouth Rock, and there they encountered the beginnings of disputes. There were those on board who said the contract of passage no longer applies because we're here and we're not where we're supposed to be. So at that point, what did they do? They signed the Mayflower Compact. And let's read important parts of that short document. The Pilgrims were also Puritans, but of a different type. That is, they were separatists, so they left. They didn't continue to engage in a fight within the Church of England. But still, it's in the name of God that they begin, and they mention that they are loyal subjects of the sovereign Lord King James. But then we go in, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. That's their first statement. In the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant. That word covenant is very important. And combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Very important. They are creating themselves and binding themselves together by this agreement for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, etc. For what? For the general good of the colony. And they commit to submitting and obedience to what? Those laws. That is a critical moment of formation in the U.S., for the U.S. later. This is 1620. Although our birth as an independent nation doesn't start until the Declaration of Independence, we owe a lot to the Puritans and the Pilgrims in particular. The Pilgrims and their declaration in the Mayflower Compact is really the beginning of self-government in this country. What they did was not perfect, either in England or over here. And certainly those who may have been persecuted or discriminated against by Puritans maybe are not fond of that history. And I don't expect Catholics in particular to be fond of it. Nevertheless, without their opposition to absolutism, even though in part they themselves imposed it in England, without that opposition, we wouldn't have gotten to the Glorious Revolution. Without the Glorious Revolution, we don't have the beginning of a transformation in the colonies and an understanding of the rights of Englishmen that then lead to the understanding of unalienable rights and the Declaration of Independence. In rereading the Declaration, we start as always with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Critics of the U.S. Constitution and of America generally point to these words and say, but we didn't treat all men equally at that point. That's true, but it's also true that as a result of the Declaration, that a few of the states in New England did immediately, almost, once freedom was secured, abolish slavery. And in fact, in Massachusetts, as a result of its Constitution in 1780, written primarily by John Adams, that the courts in Massachusetts effectively ended slavery relatively soon thereafter. Now, in part, this goes back to the fact that James Otis was always not only opposed to slavery, but spoke out against it. Adams may have been more timid on this point, but he himself was never involved in having any slaves. Again, I repeat the point. Over time, history and events were driving in the right direction. That is different from those who want an immediate utopia. It never has happened, never will happen. It's all a matter of human beings, imperfect human beings, moving in the right direction. Let's go back. Endowed by their Creator, everywhere their understanding of unalienable rights comes from a Creator, even if they don't agree on the nature of that Creator. Even Paine, later in his criticisms of Christianity, understands that there is a higher power, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As Professor Barnett mentions, pursuit of happiness was discussed by George Mason, but we've seen it's also discussed by John Adams. Again, Virginia and Massachusetts, both an understanding that goes beyond property to the pursuit of happiness, the fullness of life. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's it. That goes all the way back to the resistance in England by the Puritans and the attempt to create a republic. It was imperfect, yes, but over time and experience, it evolved to what we got in the Declaration and then, importantly, in the Constitution itself. More than once, I've raised the question of whether some of our leaders really do believe in the language of the Declaration of Independence. We know, of course, that some of them really don't support our Constitution as written. So how do we tell? Well, going back to Adams and what he said about you first determine the end and then you look to the form. What we have to look at is whether particular rulers, those in office, have the same end as described in the Declaration. Because if they don't, we're going to end up with a very different government. Remember that Justice Scalia said, if the people don't have the understanding of the Constitution as actually written, over time, that understanding will replace the actual meaning of the Constitution. So if you're not in government to serve the people and protect the unalienable rights through the form of the Constitution as written, then what is it that you're doing? Let's go back to John Adams again.
Fear is the foundation of most governments, but is so sordid and brutal a passion and renders men in whose breasts it predominates so stupid and miserable that Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution which is founded on it.
Some conservatives have written books and articles that mention the Leviathan in connection with the administrative state. That is, they've said that the administrative state is the Leviathan. That hasn't really gotten a lot of traction, but that may be changing because with the current pandemic and a climate of fear, government power seems to be growing. The pandemic has certainly created, and justifiably so, fear of mortal death. Many people have died from the virus. But remember that there are those politicians who say, never let a crisis go wasted. So what's happened during the lockdown? We've seen the suppression of speech on social media. We've seen restrictions of religious services in some states which had to be blocked by the Supreme Court. We've actually seen quite a bit of conflict, or at least differences from state to state, reminding people that we do really live in a system of federalism. It may be that we are closer to, quote, Leviathan, in the sense that there is certainly a concentration of power going on to suppress speech and control religion. In the Leviathan, Hobbes wants to control religion and to suppress speech. Those are important characteristics of the Leviathan. Otherwise, there isn't the total control that he advocates. In terms of sovereignty being absolute, not in the people, but in whoever has the power of the sovereign. That power, according to Hobbes, should not be divided. How could it be divided? By separation of powers and by federalism. Those are the main instruments of our Constitution in preventing the consolidation of power into an absolute sovereign other than the people. What I've always found interesting is that both Hobbes's Leviathan and the foundation of our government rests on, quote, covenants. Now, covenant theory is often called in politics contract theory. Covenant is a kind of very formal contract. There's more to it than the ordinary contract, at least historically. But Hobbes uses the term, and so do those who follow covenant theory, which traces back to Calvin. It's biblical language that has been around for a long time, but Calvin emphasized covenant theory in a very important way. So we've got competing covenants. On the one hand, the Hobbesian covenant allows absolute power of a mortal God, the state. On the other hand, the covenants that began with the Mayflower Compact are covenants relating human beings together in a body politic related to God. That's the fundamental difference between the two. Now, people have argued about whether Hobbes was really an atheist, whether he recognized God or what. But certainly in his politics, it was all about the mortal God, the state. The state can be changed ultimately, but while it has power, it is the mortal God, absolute. Now, they're competing powers always. Why? Because the nature of power tied to human nature, as I've said repeatedly, wants more power. Against that, I've said, separation of powers and federalism are critical. Now, federalism comes from federal theology, which is related to covenant theory. From there, where do we go? We go to the first ever theory of federalism, which was written by a Calvinist. His name was Johannes Althusius, a name that almost nobody in the United States knows, but who's critical. Why? Because until that time, there was no theory of federalism. Going back to Aristotle, federalism didn't involve a political body. That's important. It was an international arrangement. The term federal comes from the Roman treaty federa, that were so-called treaties of peace with its conquered territories. So it was international. And indeed, the first form of government we had, the Articles of Confederation, was in that form. It was a treaty, an agreement among separate states, but they saw it as more. They saw it as a political union that was unique, but it was also during our experimental period. So at the critical point, we go back and look at what Adams is saying again about the end of government, the form of government, and what type of government most countries have. We cannot let fear take over in this country. Where is the politician who will repeat the words of FDR? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Instead, some of those in government and in supporting institutions are using fear so that people be willing to not enforce certain rights, namely the rights to free speech and protection of religion. But behind that is what's happening to the structure of power. We talked already about, in federalism, the differences between state to state. But there are clear efforts from Washington in an attempt to override the authority of the states, certainly in areas related to the pandemic. And as I've already mentioned, in terms of social media suppressing speech. Why? In order to control a message, often a message of fear, you have to control speech. We also have a very disturbing phenomenon that not enough attention has been paid to. That is, remember that in the English Civil War, it was the Parliament that had control of the military. Nothing can be more dangerous. And the Puritans were always quick to react at the first sign of a threat to liberty. It ought to be a sign of a threat to liberty when we see an attempt by the Congress, or at least one house in the Congress, to act or at least persuade those in the military to act in different ways, rather than responding directly to the commander-in-chief, and to create fencing around the Capitol to suggest a climate of fear, and then to try to expand the power of the Capitol Police by projecting it in offices outside of Washington, clearly beyond the jurisdiction. It is in these ways, although apparently small at the beginning, in which you expand power. Anyone concerned about the restraints on power, separation of powers, and federalism should be awake and alert to the creeping threats that are posed by this. But, as I've said before, we can't be afraid. We have to simply speak out. And it can be in small ways, but there's a cost to it. You may lose friends. You may be criticized, but that's small compared to what not only those who founded this country went through, but those who preceded them in order to establish a framework, a government that protects unalienable rights. Thank you for joining me in this session. Look forward to having you back again in the next session. And here is a list of the authors that we will be covering then. Thank you and good night.